I mean, you got the dark side, the light side. One is selfless, one is selfish. And you want to keep them in balance. What happens when you go to the dark side is it goes out of balance, and then you get really selfish and you forget about everybody, and you ultimately lead yourself, because when you get selfish, you get stuff, or you want stuff. Mm-hmm. And when you want stuff and you get stuff, then you are afraid somebody's going to take it away from you, whether it's a person or a thing or a particular pleasure, experience. Mm-hmm. Once you become afraid that somebody's going to take it away from you, or you're going to lose it, then you start to become angry, especially if you're losing it. And that anger leads to hate. And hate leads to suffering. Mostly on the part of the person who's selfish, because you spend all your time being afraid of losing everything you've got, instead of actually living. Where joy, by giving to other people, you can't think about yourself, and therefore there's no pain. But the pleasure factor of greed and of selfishness is a short-lived experience. Therefore, you're constantly trying to replenish it. But of course, the more you replenish it, the harder it is to, so you have to keep upping the ante. You're actually afraid of the pain of not having the joy. So that is ultimately the core of the whole dark side, light side of the Force.
Can we still be friends if we like different things? Star Wars Last Jedi, the most controversial film since Antichrist. But if Last Jedi's controversy highlighted anything specific, it's that there's a growing massive disparity with modern Star Wars. From criticisms and praises from each side, it's clear some fans are starving for the simple and familiar, others there's the need for further complexity, because there's Star Wars that's a fun, escapist universe with likable characters. You know, this type of Star Wars that produces books, comics, and so forth. And there's Star Wars as a massive collection of nuanced sociological and philosophical ideas populated by documentaries, essays, the better books and comics, and even George Lucas himself.
You know, how do democracies turn back into dictatorships? Why do people who have the power to have the freedom turn it over to somebody who's going to take it all away from them?
And the baffling thing about Star Wars Last Jedi is that, sort of similar to what the prequels did, is basically threw all the common fans under the bus by alienating them and not giving them anything they want. It's not a simple space adventure situated in the familiar. Instead, we're given a strange art house film where the subtext is far richer than the actual surface reading of the events, so unless you actively exert yourself intellectually, you won't get what's the point of anything. It will just sort of come off as being pretentious and nonsensical. Whereas if you get it, the film is this sort of beautiful mosaic of rich ideas. Like normies would say, well, what's the point of the ending? All the characters just sort of end up in the same place as they start off. While if you're more artsy-fartsy and enjoy digesting the themes from a story, it's like, oh, this story is about things working in cycles. Everyone is in the same place, but the broader social landscape isn't. Last Jedi is sort of like a fairy tale in that sort of way where the details don't matter, but the ideas do, so you have to prioritize the message and theme before the literal events. And this sort of immediately makes Last Jedi incredibly inaccessible, especially compared to Force Awakens. All its goals are different. Rather than trying to replicate the past, it's actively trying to interrogate it.
Good guys, bad guys, made up words. It's all a machine, partner.
But Last Jedi is an incredibly awkward film because I think it's safe to say that Rian Johnson fell in love too much with a story because there's too many ideas, so it's sort of awkwardly schizophrenic. Instead of prioritizing one idea and having all the others stem from it, it chose to run everything equally. Rey's storyline is given equal screen time to Finn and Rose's storyline, but they both have their own subplots that also have their own beginning, middle, and end. But I wouldn't say this is a mess because Rian Johnson is genuinely talented, so he did correlate the underpinning momentums together. One is about the death of an old structure and the other is about the rebirth of another. So there's a cohesive story and complete themes here that is sort of muddled in execution from so much that's going on. It's like two films happening at the same time. But also, not to mention, to get the most from the story, you also have to be able to recognize how the drama connects with the larger theme, because it's a story about people dealing with the inner sense of empty grandiosity, while it's also about society losing its old ideologies to a similar sense of hubris, which is then used to discuss how history works in cycles. But it also opens with a mum joke
about his mother.
Yeah, you see what I mean when this film is awkward but sort of undeniably beautiful? I did a video a while back where I analysed Rogue One as this massive metaphor for postmodernity that interrogated Star Wars by being in a different genre, which deliberately juxtaposed itself to the rest of the films in order to dismantle the tropes and all sorts. And well, Last Jedi also deconstructs Star Wars, but in a different, less metatextual way, because it's the story itself that directly dismantles the entire lore and inner workings of the universe. Last Jedi's main aim is seemingly to scrutinize and examine the relationship between people and ideas in the already preconceived Star Wars universe's social structures and ideologies.
Now that they're extinct, the Jedi are romanticized, deified. But if you strip away the myth and look at their deeds, the legacy of the Jedi is failure.
You see, Last Jedi is kind of like if Game of Thrones was written as the sequel to Lord of the Rings, where it's the same genre of fiction, but it completely opposes the other in terms of artistic philosophy. Both the original Star Wars and Lord of the Rings sees the world through the lens of modernism, because they affirm the tradition of the old archetypical ideas. Good and evil, war, something heroic, heroes and villains. But Last Jedi and the Song of Ice and Fire sees the story through the lens of postmodernism. So it rejects and dismantles these old notions by giving you the morally grey and no good and evil, just competing perspectives. The first action scene in the movie is the most evident of this. Poe makes a mom joke, which sets up his insecure relationship with his maternal figure, and more importantly, his ego, which does lead to success because it blows up the First Order dreadnought, but it does cause the death of the entire bombing fleet, which is particularly lingered upon in the opening. We're immediately faced with the uncomfortable relationship between ideologies and egos, and how it doesn't quite line up with reality, and as a result, the harsh consequences because of it. Poe, Luke, Rey, and Kylo are all blinded in the story from their own sense of grandiosity, and for all the characters, it hides something else inside them.
You're demoted.
What? Wait.
Poe is effectively the classic Star Wars hero archetype, someone who sees the situation with the filter of heroic bravado and is unaware of the consequences, so he just wants to keep fighting despite the odds and casualties. It's not until all of his impulsively made up plans blow up in his face one by one, and Leia, his maternal figure that he was trying to impress all the time, shoots him in the goddamn chest, that he has his turning point and learns to be more patient and less aggressive because there was a fully working plan right in front of him. It's a story about a child playing at war, and more importantly about surrendering ego. Rey had big expectations from Luke and from her own self-identity, because her egoic desires is used to hide her sense of lonely inadequacy, and it's not until she loses those expectations and confronts her inner illusions that she loses her sense of false grandiosity. Without sounding like I've got a fetish, I love how this is illustrated with her hands. She puts her hand out for Luke, then to Kylo, both hoping for someone to take it, but once she accepts reality, she rejects Kylo at the end to overcome her temptations, and thus becomes the one who holds her hand out for other people. Her story is also about surrendering ego. Luke fell in love with his own legacy, and also became too in love with the ideology of the Jedi that he was blinded to history repeating itself. He becomes similar to both his father and of Obi-Wan when it comes to developing consequentialist views. So after his failures, despite having recognized the historical hubris of the Jedi Order, he hasn't recognized his very own hubris formed by his everlasting guilt, so it's not until he can let go of the old ideologies and his pride truly and honestly that he can confront his pain, not as a fighter but as a pacifist, as a peaceful man. His story is also about surrendering ego. While Kylo Ren is an angry child trapped in a cycle that he sees himself as being above, he is both a victim and a perpetrator. There's really nice detail in Adam Driver's performance, the way he interacts with Snoke. Like when Snoke flings the lightsaber, Kylo moves his head like an abused child, but his character is the only one that doesn't change because he doesn't confront his pain but rather sees himself above it. Unlike everyone else, his story is actually about the failure to surrender ego. And so the villain of Last Jedi isn't Snoke or the evil ships, but the human sense of grandiosity. When Snoke dies, it doesn't really matter, because the real challenge is dealing with our egos being torn apart before our very eyes, and learning to have the humility to accept our own egoic identities as what they are. Lies. Both DJ and Finn offer alternative perspectives to these egos. To them, they are all the same, personality cards for an ideological war machine. Finn was willing to run away, and DJ sells them out because the war is completely pointless to him.
Sorry, but this fleet is doomed, and if my friend comes back to it, she's doomed too.
Now, I mentioned this once and I'll mention it again. A key component of Star Wars is the politics. One of the most obvious reasons why the original Star Wars was so immersive was because of George Lucas's inner rebellious excitement to tell a story that was a youthful condemnation of the Vietnam War. Obviously, he loved fantasy and myths too, but his passion for politics is undeniably a powerful fuel throughout all the films. And Last Jedi has a similar sociological dimension, albeit not as angry, and that's the passion to analyze the distance with ideologies and reality. All the character drama fit directly to tell this larger, more complex view. The movie specifically focused on the social topic of secularization, the process where religious institutions loses its significance. One of my old crappier videos is all about it, whatever. To explain it, another word for ideology is meta-narrative, a story that places life into positions of a story. An example is Marxism, because it sees the working class as being victims and the upper class as being perpetrators. It sees the world through a conflict between these two parties. The Jedi ideology does a similar thing. It sees life from the viewpoint of the dark side and the light side. The Sith must be destroyed to bring balance and all that jazz. What's fascinating about Last Jedi is the validity of this ideology is examined to its fullest. It understands that to see life as a conflict is to strive for supremacy, and because of this, death and war is an everlasting cycle. But because religion is no longer socially prominent, all we have is just the war with no moral reality. Everyone else in this galaxy sees this conflict with a postmodern sense of skepticism, in the sense that there's no heroes or villains, just soldiers, and just egos butting heads. This is why Canto Bight is sort of awkward, because it's completely unnecessary in terms of the narrative, but is completely necessary for the story, because it's used to directly illustrate all of this. That this galaxy of ongoing war from the last 80 years has made the galaxy reorganized with a hierarchy that doesn't place religious institutions at the top, but cold and vert economics, aka the military-industrial complex.
There's only one business in the galaxy that'll get you this rich.
War.
Selling weapons to the First Order.
The reason why Canto Bight is so awkwardly prominent is pretty much the consequence of Force Awakens, because that movie was so preoccupied with nostalgia and replicating the past that it stagnated any original natural artistic direction, including establishing the setting of this new story. If you think about it, there was absolutely nothing to build off of that has depth from that film. We know that the galaxy need Luke, but we don't know why in any deeper level than, oh, he needs to fight the First Order, and that we, the dumb audience, would be excited to see him return. So the Canto Bight stuff really should have happened in Force Awakens. Like, instead of going to the "remember this cantina," they should have went to a morally deprived place where the war profiteers hang out, or at the very minimum, give Han Solo a line like, "Don't talk to anyone. These are the opportunists who don't care about this war. They only want to make a profit from selling weapons and all. Just like me before I met Luke. And this is why we need him back." Or something more subtle. But you know what I mean. For Last Jedi to have a story that's original and has depth, it's put into the unfair position of having to plant seeds that needs to grow immediately. It's establishing and continuing a story at the same time. So now Last Jedi awkwardly compensated by having a detour that's just as large as the main plot, while exploring just as much intricately complex ideas as the main story. And this is where I think the film loses a lot of people, because to artistically punctuate what it's establishing, the storyline leads to a dead end in order to say that this direction of the world is in itself a dead end. The criminal with the heart of gold is just a criminal because the notion of heroes is made irrelevant in this social change.
They blow you up today, you blow them up tomorrow. It's just business.
It's like a really, really artsy-fartsy thing for like a movie to do. Like, this is what you would do in an art house film. Whatever, I'm going off, it's not big now. The solution is to transfer the moral authority from the Jedi to the Resistance, which is why the turning point begins when Yoda burns down the tree and the ancient Jedi text, because for a new world to exist, the foundations of a new ideology has to replace it. Rey becomes the next spark who carries the light over from the Jedi to the Resistance. As someone who believes in the complications beyond good and evil, she comes from no famous bloodline, so there's no sense of superiority, a fresh beginning. As Kylo says, she has no place in the story, but this is a new one. The tale of a resistance losing their home, beaten, slaughtered, alone with no one else to answer their call, is saved by the legendary Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi. These events provide the resistance ideological legitimacy as a form of moral authority in this world that no longer believes in it.
To say that if the Jedi die, the light dies is vanity. Can you feel that?
We are the spark that will light the fire that will restore the Republic.
We have to help him. We have to fight.
No. We are the spark that'll light the fire that'll burn the First Order down.
The kids at the end have something to look up to, and so a stronger societal foundation for a new rebellion is made fertile to build on, which is still kind of ridiculous because it's only like 20 people left. But this is one of the strange oddities about this film. More than any other Star Wars film, Last Jedi is like a fairy tale in the sense that the moral and meaning overshadows the individual literal events and details. So I can understand why some fans would call bullshit and why I was in love from the film's complexity and its artistic direction. Both layers work in harmony for a single cohesive answer. The movie comes to the realization that the only direction for ideologies should be to preserve life and not to fight. These are the only acts that are successful in the film. Every one of Poe's impulsive attack strategies leads to more death, and it's not until he retreats that the dying stops. But moments like Hodo's original plan, Rose saving those animals and giving those kids a moment, Luke and Rey coming back to save everyone, ends up shining far brighter in the faders of all. If DJ is presented as an outsider's viewpoint, Rose is the ultimate insider's perspective. Being a character that grew up oppressed by an amoral world, she understands that ideologies can't hope to vanquish other rival ideological structures, but it can still emancipate all forms of social pathologies. It can free the mind from hopelessness. That's why we don't need to know what the kid's name is at the end or if he's important. All you need to know is that now he's got a hopeful determination in his eyes. Ideologies give the rebellious and disenchanted a home and create a community for those that aspire more. Or as she phrased it,
I saved you. Tell me. That's how we're gonna win. Not fighting what we hate. Saving what we love.
and that's what makes Finn completely change by the end. He finally has a home now. He goes from abandoning everyone to go after a hot lady to be willing to die for the cause. Everyone fits together at the end for this message. This is the awkward thing about Last Jedi. A lot of ideas happen while not a lot of events happen. So it's almost too dense to the point that its substance becomes inaccessible to a typical Joe who just wants to watch a movie to escape the day. But it's why pompous people like me love it, because it's such a powerful and beautiful holistic examination of the very conceptual foundations of Star Wars.
How do we build a rebellion from this?
We have everything we need.
Artists are not obliged to giving the audience what they want, otherwise it's a business, not art. Rather, the job of the artist is to express what they want. And that's why art, and especially film as a medium, is so powerful, because it allows you to see the world through the lenses of someone else. But artists still have to be attentive when it comes to the audience's own perspective in order to negotiate engagement. I think Robert McKee in Story said it the best. When talented people write badly, it's generally for one of two reasons. Either they're blinded by an idea they feel compelled to prove, or they're driven by an emotion they must express. When talented people write well, it is generally for this reason. They're moved by a desire to touch the audience. Last Jedi rides this line dangerously. For some people, Rian Johnson stretched things too far to be engaging, and that's understandable. This is especially awkward when this is the main installment to one of the most famous American international franchises ever. I think when it comes to the opposite opinion, someone like Mr. Plinkett really put it the best, which is that Rian Johnson, instead of showing us something fun, showed us something fun but educational too. That's not fun. That's my really bad Mr. Plinkett impression, goddamn. And that perfectly summarizes the divide, I think. Maybe it has something to do with the different appeals of Star Wars, or maybe with age. The older nerds get worked up about plot holes, while the younger nerds get worked up about political and artistic subtext.
Liking comic books is popular, environmental awareness, being tolerant. If I was just born 10 years later, I would have been the coolest person ever.
And obviously I'm incredibly overgeneralizing here, and not everyone fits into this divide, but it certainly does when it comes to the most vocal on the internet. You can't please everyone, because for me, I really didn't like Force Awakens, because it left me so hopeless for Star Wars afterwards. I was so disheartened to see a franchise from my childhood that, at every turn, apart from Return of the Jedi, veered away from shallow novelty, that chose to be honest in expressing powerful ideas, even if it was awkward in execution. And it seemed like all of a sudden this franchise that I loved so dearly was doomed to be artificially pleasing with its unoriginality and focus group constructed shallowness. And the way people applauded that low effort written film made me feel so unbelievably alienated. But for 1 second, while watching Last Jedi in the multiplex, I truly felt included again, because here it was, a big universe of immersive ideas.
That force does not belong to the Jedi. To say that if the Jedi Jedi die, the light dies its vanity. Can you feel that?
We are the spark that will light the fire that will restore the Republic. That spark, this resistance must survive. That is our mission.
Stalling so we can escape.
Escape? He's one man against an army. We have to help him. We have to fight.
No. We are the spark that'll light the fire that'll burn the First Order down.